Oh no, we've just done that.
We're live. We'll reconvene. Back to you. No, back to you.
Yes, well, I was just going to let you know, so during the break we've agreed that it would be useful for us if we do go through your section 42A. I had some questions falling out of it, that if at any point in the section 42A it's been picked up and dealt with in the supplementary, just flag it, because I have got questions on the section 42A, questions on the supplementary, haven't necessarily rationalised them, so feel free to pipe up and say that's in the supplementary. No, so in paragraph 126 of your section 42A, you're addressing a Fulton Hogan submission and rejecting their wording in relation to EWP3. And so you've left it saying, allow for earthworks of a limited bulk and scale within areas of potential inundation to ensure these do not exacerbate inundation or flooding. And Fulton Hogan was saying, provided these do not exacerbate inundation or flooding.
Yeah, sure. So that links back to reflect the rule, which is, so the rule is conditional, or it does have an allowance of limited bulk. So it was just, if we rephrase that, I felt that it wasn't accurately reflecting the method we were using. So, because there is a small allowance, and it's the limitation that's seeking to ensure that the flooding effects are not exacerbated.
Thank you. It's just good to have that repeated. I believe that is what you're saying in your report, but that was a nice clarification. Thank you. At paragraph 129 is where the ADP protocol comes in, and a question I've got in my mind, because of the Heritage New Zealand submission, I can understand why you've said no to the matter that they've put forward, but it did raise a question for me. Like, your response was, well, we're dealing with all of these matters listed in the standards, so there's a clear linkage. And then it left me wondering, where is the ADP that links non-Māori archaeology to notification to Heritage New Zealand?
Yes, so there is there's the Heritage New Zealand Accidental Discovery Protocol, and then there is the Ngāi Tahu specific one, where you need to contact the Hokonui Runanga. So this is set out in the standard, and it's also in the note. I mean, they're broadly similar, really. It's just who you contact in what instance.
Okay, I think it was the inclusive of Ngāi Tahu tikanga and values in the matter 7 in P4, so that I guess its prominence is Ngāi Tahu.
Highlighted as opposed, yes, it is that inclusive, so it's not limited to, it's inclusive of, and it was feedback from the Runanga that they wanted, because often when it's the Heritage New Zealand Accidental Discovery Protocol that's kind of the more known one, and they wanted to ensure that their protocol was also adhered to. So perhaps it ended up almost the other way around.
But then I guess it's addressed in the standard itself, is your
Yes.
point. Yep.
Yeah.
At paragraph 145, you're responding to a matter around P5 and 3, which is the Ngāi Tahu submission point. And my question was, just remind me, are there any silent files in the district? So the Ngāi Tahu submission point had silent files in it, silent files in Wahitapu. And I was casting back and I thought, I'm pretty sure we don't have any silent files.
No, that was the crux of it, that
Yeah.
those words were sneaking in, but there is actually none. So,
Yeah. And I saw that when you responded in your proposed wording, you've made use of Wahitapu and left off silent files. So I just wanted to do a double check that I was right about that. Yep. And I could also see in the way that you dealt with the wording changes in P5 that you'd picked up parts of what Ngāi Tahu had put forward
yes.
and positioned them within the policy. Kia ora. I'm going to weed out ones that we've already talked about as I go down. So if I go quiet, that's what I'm doing. When we were having the discussion before about commercial forestry, you know, like I think that point around the NES takes precedence unless provision is made in the NES for the district plan to deal with a matter. And so where the plan is silent, the default is to the NES, commercial forestry, and what it manages. And elsewhere in the plan, we've got a likely note coming through to just emphasise that whenever the matter arises.
Yeah, there could be a note to direct people to look at the NES, because it is a regional council matter. In the commercial forestry NES, there's a specific rule that says you're not permitted in a district plan, but you can make, in certain areas, you can make rules more restrictive, typically about those like landscape values and significant natural areas. So, but that's not for the earthworks chapter, I suppose.
Yes, that's right, yeah. I actually think a lot of this we've talked as I'm going through, and most we have already discussed. So I think we're almost at the end of my questions. I'll just. Okay, so it took me a while to get down to the next one, which was paragraph 278, where it's where you're discussing EWS3, the setbacks from rivers and streams, and you've responded to the doc submission on this point, and I guess it was just a side note, where you're indicating at different times that the eco chapter's picking up matters. It's just a note, is this an aspect that may involve some consequential amendments following the eco hearing? Could we do, if there's a reliance placed on what's happening in the eco chapter as we resolve what's happening there, can you envisage any potential for consequential amendments in this chapter?
I mean, it would potentially be in relation to the council authorised biodiversity management plan, I suppose. That's a little bit of an unknown. It is a concept that comes through the NPSIB. Yeah. Otherwise, the proposed changes pretty much aligns with what was discussed in the general rural zone hearing and stream setbacks, so there is consistency between them.
Thanks. It was the management plan that I was wondering about. Yeah. So. That's it. I look at everything else that I had noted down, and we've already discussed it. I'm just going to check the questions I had on the supplementary. We may have also covered them. The end. Yeah.
Just working through, looking for questions. Sometimes the question is dealt with in the assessment. So.
No, we've come to the end of the topic. I have nothing left to ask you. Thank you very kindly for all your responses, and we'll craft up, a refined minute to respond to some of the things that came up this morning. So kia ora.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, look, if we have no other questions, we'll come back to you.
Sounds reasonable.
What time do you need to be away?
Oh, sorry, I need to leave basically after lunch, but, hold on. Well, depends on when lunch is, but yeah, so I probably should leave here around 1:30.
Did you enjoy reading my 42,000 word report? No. I didn't enjoy writing it, perhaps.
It was hard going.
Yeah. Cool. I will take it as semi-read, the 42A, and just briefly go over my supplementary evidence. Some of the questions we've already sort of discussed, but I'll just do a general overview. So Department of Conservation pointed out that while the NPS for renewable energy generation does exclude the NPSIB from consideration, that doesn't mean Part 2 of the RMA and the RPS is excluded. So we have recommended incorporating some of these into the policies, which if you look at Appendix B, the green text, where are we? So Energy Policy 11 is probably, and I think I might be missing one somewhere. Policy 1 and Policy 11, there's some changes there. I didn't recommend amending changes to the rule framework because I thought that was best placed in the eco chapter, for the reasons being that impacts on biodiversity are largely to do with removing indigenous vegetation, which doesn't need a critical infrastructure specific or sort of energy specific rule. It's just the act of removing biodiversity. So that's the reasons there. Transpower, Ms. McLeod and I were aligned in pretty much everything. She raised yesterday the Note 1 aspect. She did send through some objectives and policies that she felt were in conflict with the provision of the national grid through a few zones. These were largely limited to residential areas, and my position remains that sort of consideration of zone specific. You know, I wouldn't necessarily want large infrastructure in residential areas. However, the panel is welcome to disagree. Other than that, I thought her proposed changes were, I agreed with her reasoning, and that's all laid out there. Where are we? Greenbrier. So this was an ongoing theme for Greenbrier's submission, where they essentially wanted the energy chapter to enable the extraction of coal or lignite, whereas we thought that was best placed within the rural chapter, and I think they've got, you know, I haven't been involved in the Greenbrier precinct or whatever it is, but they have pushed back against some of the, they basically don't want the energy chapter to be in conflict, so they don't want it to mean that they can't do what they want to do, which I think there's some room there. So in the overview, there's some changes in green text in Appendix B.
They wanted recognition of transition, the use of non-renewables
Yes.
to transition, didn't they?
So we've amended it
Okay.
to give a little bit more of a recognition that there is a transition period. It's sort of just changing the tone of words that were already there, but I'm happy with the amended wording. So it's just the green text on Appendix B there.
So, in when I read that green text and when I read the overview, it seemed to me have, you know, a lot of the reason for that in the talk of transition is thinking about effects of climate change and emissions reduction, but actually, I don't see reference to climate change or emissions reduction. We've got it in other parts of the plan, but it's not here in the overview, and I think it's, while it's sort of inferred, it's not explicit, and that this relationship between renewable and non-renewable in these requested additions, you know, would seem to me to sort of lend themselves to making some sort of reference to
Yeah, I think
that.
that's correct. It's probably not as explicit as it could be in the overview. I guess the actual objectives, policies and rules sort of feed in for that, but potentially there's a missing link in the overview that could pull, you know, tie that together more succinctly. Kiwi Rail. So I agreed with Ms. Taylor's thoughts that, where was it? The rail corridor denotes the physical space. However, rail network utility activities within the rail corridor might be more appropriate in the critical infrastructure definition. And I agree with her point that the rest of the definition is more activities based rather than areas based. So I've recommended we do make that change. And then there's, we talked about it briefly yesterday, with the standard 4 of adding in a matter of discretion, and I've just sort of tied it into what we've already got there for consideration of the safety and functionality of the road. So I've included rail network in there as well. So it's not her exact requested wording, but I think it meets the intent of her wording and without, while being as succinct as possible. PowerNet. So I have rejected Ms. Justice's recommendation for Infrastructure Policy 2 to be amended to refer only to urban areas. While the rule framework basically directs this, where practicable, I would still like to see undergrounding and wouldn't want to rule that out. So it's probably not a hill I'm going to die on, but yeah, I don't want to exclude the undergrounding where it is practicable for that to happen. And I think having the wording that there is, you're only looking at these policies if you're breaching a district plan rule anyway, and that word practicable helps to make sure that you're not requesting unreasonable levels of undergrounding. And then the electricity distribution network. So I agree that there's probably room for that in this plan. The definition put forward, I think, was quite broad. The Dunedin City Council example's much more nuanced, and I think if PowerNet is able to provide a bit more sort of targeted relief, that's something that we could consider. But in lieu of that, I have rejected it in my supplementary evidence, but I wouldn't reject the intent of it. I just want to have it a little bit more targeted. And I know, Shelley from yesterday did just raise one issue that she thought, so having maps which could be updated as the network's expanded, there's an issue with certainty from a legal perspective, so she was a little bit cautious about that idea, but potentially looking at other plans, Dunedin might be a good example where they sort of list specific infrastructure that would meet that definition, or have it a bit more targeted, so instead of distribution lines, 33 kV lines, or just to narrow it down a little bit.
Yeah, I think they were clear that the mapping was only going to capture the 33 kV lines and tie them in because they were the most critical.
That is in the plan already as an information layer, so that could be tied into whatever rule falls out of having electricity distribution provided for specifically within the plan.
So process-wise, what do you propose that we do to advance this? Because I think the value of being clear that similar types of issues can arise for the distribution network as can arise for the transmission network, and that it is a component of critical infrastructure. Perhaps if you just help me a little bit to understand what your concern is. I'm now just trying to find, I've temporarily lost the PowerNet evidence. Find it again would be quite good. Let's have a look. So going into Ms. Justice's evidence, if you could just talk me through what your reservations are, and we'll see.
I guess with the electricity distribution definition that she's put forward being quite broad, it could mean that sort of too many activities within that yard are then unnecessarily restricted if it's too broad a categorisation. Would be one concern. In terms of process, Shelley had suggested either a minute by the panel or as a less desirable way through, I guess, PowerNet going through the appeals mediation, but I would prefer the minute over that.
Okay, I think that's a good way to go.
And she suspects Dunedin City Council, that's probably how they got that. was through mediation. It's just because it's quite broad, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what could be the issue. I don't want unintended things to be captured or be overly strict for activities within proximity to those activities. But I do agree that there's scope for it. Cool. Just her point of the 33 kV power net lines, they are in the GIS maps, just as an information only overlay. And then I think there's a with the height of poles. So infrastructure standard 3, height of poles and masts. So I've recommended rejecting Ms. Justice's relief in favour of Mr. Anderson's relief. I just felt that his relief was a little bit more targeted and more zone specific. So we'll get to his in a second, but essentially his suggestion that the rural environment be up to 35 metres, the industrial zone 25 metres, which is what it is proposed now, and then all other zones 5 metres above the zone height. So I've rejected her specific relief, but in favour of quite similar relief, just more targeted through Mr. Anderson's. And then, yes, Mr. Anderson. So he raised the similar things to Ms. McLeod about note 1. So I think possibly there's a little bit of a misunderstanding there. So where I have said, just read it, the rules and standards in Part 3 area-specific matters, bracket zones, do not apply to activities managed under this chapter unless expressly identified within the chapter. When I say unless identified within the chapter, I'm referring to this chapter, where I've tied in various standards, for instance, the height of the zone. I'm not meaning where infrastructure rules are provided in district, in those zone specific chapters. So just a bit of a clarification there. And then where Mr. Anderson has wanted functional and operational need to be included in Objective 4. So I've recommended saying no to that because I believe it's more appropriate as a policy. However, I do notice it's all through the energy policies. So I'm not exactly being consistent there. So do what you will with that.
Just excuse me, I want to go back and look for something and I can't find it. I think it's associated with Greenbrier. There's a mention of offsetting in here somewhere and I've struggled to find it and I can't find it. And I think it's in your recommendation somewhere.
In my 42A, do you think?
I think in
I
your...
could just word search my 42A. In my supplementary evidence, do you think? Okay. There's probably quite a few mentions. Oh, there's 8 mentions.
Doesn't really produce an environmental benefit. It's just another layer of cost into an activity. So, yeah.
So which policy or which provision within my chapter is the issue?
Yeah, Keith's looking for...
Okay. It does. Yeah. I think...
It comes up in the context of the nuclear wanting expensive Greenbrier.
I do have it in Energy Policy 1. Recognise the benefits of renewable electricity generation activities, including but not limited to reducing or offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure I've included it anywhere else. I know it was a requested relief, and I think I've rejected it.
We'll find it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Cool. And then infrastructure rule 4. This was a little bit of a headache, and I agree with Mr. Anderson's point that it's confusing. So, in the 42A recommendation, as a result of Mercury Energy wanting to clarify where electric vehicle charging stations are covered, we just wanted to make it clear that they were covered, and we popped it in this rule. So, with or without that change, this rule became the default rule for above ground infrastructure. I believe when it was first drafted, it was probably intended just to encourage undergrounding of lines. However, it sort of expanded and you ended up with this. So I've recommended adopting Mr. Anderson's requested relief, where essentially above ground infrastructure is permitted provided you comply with the infrastructure standards, but I have just put an extra area recommendation of 40 square metres just to kind of contain it a little bit. Otherwise, I was concerned you might end up with big sort of substation type things in a resident. Probably not, but I just needed some sort of containment there. So that's where I've landed in my recommendation.
And following the dialogue I had with him, I could see the logic in being explicit that EV charging stations were envisaged by this. And so that idea of including and whether anything else might need to be included, but just that intent of the original notified version was to make it visible. So I wonder if that could just come through and be reinstated as an including.
We haven't so far recommended including the electric vehicle charging stations, as then it sort of starts to feel like, do you include every possible thing, which some plans have. I think Selwyn's pretty much got a rule for any possible infrastructure building, but yeah, I mean, we can put it as an including, and then if it's not limited to, then it covers it and is clear where it sits.
Yes, that's right, because I think as you've just explained, it was the original intent to make it visible. So no one was left in any doubt, and no, it does say anything that's not otherwise addressed, and so scoops up everything, but it's potentially helpful, whilst not actually changing the function of the rule.
And then just in regards to infrastructure rule 8, I think Mr. Anderson, I think I possibly wasn't quite clear on what he was asking, but he seems to be asking to exceed the permitted regulations of the NETSF. So I think I've rejected that with the recommendation that we align with the NESTF. And then
Sorry, is this in relation to the dish?
yes.
I'm trying to find
I just
the
wasn't
rule.
convinced we should move away from the NES. But happy to have that as a discussion.
Is it that the district plan can be more permissive or restrictive? Does it give us that room? Presumably it does if they're asking for it.
Yeah, presumably it does. I think I just wasn't convinced that it's needed.
And then my turnaround on that is, given that everything we're doing is because we've identified like an effect or an issue that we think is a concern, what are our concerns with the impact of the difference?
Probably a fair question. My concern was more about alignment with national direction. I'm probably not concerned about the actual difference in effects between what he's asking and what's in the plan. Yes, and then Mr. Anderson has requested for a restricted discretionary activity status of establishment of new infrastructure within specified areas. I haven't supported that relief. Those specified areas have been pretty carefully considered, and I do think a discretionary activity status is appropriate in those areas. The navigable river thing. So there is a definition in the Environment, Southland Navigation Safety Bylaw. So I was thinking yesterday that that might be an easy solution, just to pop that same definition into the district plan. As Keith said, there are 2 rivers, and yes, we could name them. My concern was more about over-capturing, and it's probably not a concern that's actually that feasible. But I come from an area where river levels change a lot, and sometimes permanently. So I guess I didn't want to map them in case, something dried up and then it's not navigable anymore, but you still need to provide these same sort of restrictions, whereas a definition is a little bit more fluid. But in terms of what's actually a realistic concern, that probably isn't. So I'm open to either naming them or having that definition in there.
I think the reference to the navigation safety bylaw is very helpful. Yeah, and does that also have the navigable flow element?
I don't think it does. Could you quickly bring it up?
Because I thought that's quite critical for the function of the rule, so we need to know what that means.
Oh no, I've got it in here. It means any waters, whether coastal or inland, which are able to be navigated, and includes harbours. So it's a pretty broad definition. My take on that would be navigated in a boat. You're not wading down a river.
And where is that definition?
I've just on paragraph 132 of my supplementary evidence.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then we come to the permitted height limits. So I've agreed with Mr. Anderson's suggestion there.
Can I just ask a question about that? Wireless were discussing the effects of height limits as well in their submission.
In my 42A?
Yes.
Yeah, or in their submission.
Page 71, right, 419. I'm just wondering, you asked for further information?
We haven't received anything.
You haven't received. So do you think the change in height limits is going to...
I probably wouldn't want to speak on
Relate
behalf of
concerns.
Wireless for that. I would assume that their requirements would align pretty closely with the telco requirements, but that's an assumption. I can't speak on behalf of Wireless there.
I'm just wondering what they were actually asking for.
I was wondering that too, which is what I'm just
Yes.
reading it now. Wireless's further submissions are acknowledged, so it is unclear from their submission what specific changes they are requesting. And they had put that same submission on every standard, and a lot of them didn't relate to height, so I think that sort of possibly added to the confusion. But yeah, without hearing from them, I couldn't say.
No, that's fine.
Can
Thank
I
you.
just go? I've just pulled up the navigation bylaw, and in effect, the definition for an inland area like this, navigable waters means any waters able to be navigated. Well, at different times of the year, the waters will not be navigated because of low flows. So is that something that the panel has to have regard to?
I'm just going to quickly have a look at the rule. Does someone have a rule where it's referring to navigable waters in front of them? Just to save me.
So it's standard 1, INF standard 1, above ground lines are to be at least 10 metres above the water level of a navigable water body when at its maximum navigable flow.
There we go. I think so. The maximum navigable flow probably answers that for you. So it's not at its lowest; it's at its maximum, which makes sense with that standard. You want to make sure that you're not taking out anyone.
And if it's in flood, then it's not navigable.
Exactly.
I just have I just wondering if this would, it's just a wording one in your key. And it's page 9
Sorry, of which chapter?
of the key, the infrastructure
Infrastructure.
key. And it's got land inside of the riverside. And I just wondered if we could just change that to land on the riverside.
Yes. Yes, I read that a few times and thought I should do something about that. So yes, please. It's just very wordy the way it is at the moment. Yeah, I think that came from but yeah. And then the temporary activities chapter aspect. So temp R10, he requested that be moved into the infrastructure chapter, and that sort of raises an ongoing discussion we've been having. Our position is that it's best placed in the temporary activities chapter, but we have recommended his addition of are located on site for a duration which does not exceed 12 months. Yeah, I guess it's a structure.
Can you just remind me, if we're thinking about the National Planning Standards and infrastructure matters being in the infrastructure chapter, what's your rationale for not thinking that temporary infrastructure might be in that camp?
I guess it's more of a temporary factor than it is an infrastructure factor. Is probably more why we put it in there. So I'm just bringing up the rule. Yeah, so I guess the same national planning standards apply to temporary activities, in that if they're temporary, they should be housed in the chapter. And so this, on balance, was considered more of a temporary nature rather than an infrastructure nature. But yeah, I guess it depends on how the panel wants to make any structural changes, as long as the rule is somewhere. Yeah. Well, I think that might be it in terms of Mr. Anderson's submission.
Sorry, in the 12 months aspect, did you pick up the continuous idea?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, we've put that in. We haven't, so that was, can we just go over that again? So we've recommended adopting Mr. Anderson's relief in terms of the 12-month thing, but happy for, it to be continuous, to make it clear. I mean, yeah. And then there was a number of other submissions for Telco that sort of sought broadly the same as Mr. Anderson. There was a little bit of, the height was varying a little bit, so I've recommended supporting Mr. Anderson's submission there where it conflicts with any other Telco. They've really just reiterated some of his points.
Can I just check, because of our dialogue yesterday around co-location, so wanting to encourage co-location, which we've got at the direction level, and then we get down into the rules, and co-location, as we've established, would not just be the 5 metres above the building height of the zone, it would be 10 metres to accommodate co-location. So quite a significant jump up. essentially, are we then saying that the permitted standard would be the 5 metres above the zone height, but co-location would require a resource consent?
Could you point me to the rule for co-location? Just
I think
More
that's what
standard?
I'm getting at. I'm trying to work out how the rules deal with co-location, because we've got policy, which I'm now trying to find as well. You responded, I'm sure, to that request for, and now I'm trying to find it as well.
I'm looking to. Yeah, there's 17 references to it.
Infrastructure P4, encourage co-location and sharing of infrastructure. So I know it's just encourage, so
Yeah.
that wouldn't preclude that a co-location would potentially be a matter for a resource consent. I just wanted to know that we were being thoughtful about that when we get down to the rules and these height limits, knowing from that evidence yesterday that co-location does involve quite a significant jump above the height limit. It's another 5 metres. But we want to encourage co-location, so what are the rules doing in response to that?
I think when we discussed this, we sort of ended up landing on co-location being a little bit of a industry self-enforcing thing because it's cheaper to co-locate. So I'm not sure it did end up in the rules. I'm just
No, so what I'm looking at, infrastructure standard 3 is where these heights are coming in, and so it would then ping to a restricted discretionary activity for co-located.
Yeah. Yeah, potentially we could consider an extra 5 metres for co-location, though in residential areas that is then getting quite high, in which case potentially a restricted discretionary activity, noting it's got the policy support for co-location, could be more appropriate and allow for a bit more site-specific consideration.
Yeah, so then where you've got those heights in infrastructure S3 that are outside the more potentially sensitive zones like residential.
Yeah, so potentially in infrastructure standard 3, 1 and 2, so rural zones and industrial zones, potentially we could allow for as a permitted activity an additional 5 metres if the structure was co-locating with other infrastructure. I think on balance then you're reducing the amount of structures, so from an amenity perspective in those less sensitive areas that's suitable. I'd be less supportive in residential areas.
Okay, that's really helpful because it was bubbling away and it didn't feel resolved, but that seems a potential approach right there.
Fire and emergency. So this was evidence received a bit later. So throughout the district plan review, we've been sort of seeking clarification from FENZ of what these structures actually look like to get a better of idea of what exemption they're seeking. That was received on the 30th of October, and then I called Miss, I might pronounce her last name wrong, Orangi, that day, and asked just for some visual evidence and potentially some effects-based reasoning, which she provided on the 31st of October. If anything, I think this evidence kind of demonstrates why it's not appropriate to exempt these structures. Particularly, I've put it in my supplementary evidence, the Topor example. That's quite big, and I don't think it is comparable to TV aerials and chimneys, which is what she suggested. And as she said, sort of effects can be largely anticipated. Yes, they're not great effects. We want to avoid them, and that it won't apply to that many situations, in which case I don't think it's a overly onerous consent burden to ask them to do.
And probably the other thing that occurred to me is that where these are existing in the district, they're presumably able to rely on existing use rights. So this is only going to
This is
arise.
only for new structures.
Yeah,
that
new
we're talking
structures.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have recommended declining that requested relief. And I have talked to, this has been an ongoing thing throughout the various zones, and I've talked to the rest of the planning team, and they've concurred with my reasoning there. Further evidence from...
Sorry, just to check then, is where, when, if they go into the consenting realm, is the policy support for, is there anything to consider in relation to policy support, or are we sufficient with what we have?
I think we are. So objective 1, the benefits of infrastructure are realised by providing essential and secure services as part of local, regional, national networks, including in emergencies. Enables people and communities to provide for their health, safety and well-being. Yeah, I think there are a number of objective and policy support there that if it's located appropriately, that's suitable. But I do think you need to, consider the effects on neighbours in particular for structures like that. And then there was some evidence provided from Mercury Energy late last week. So it was really useful for Mercury to clarify what definition they were requesting. It was just a little bit unclear in their initial submission. So they've suggested that we align with the MPS for renewable electricity generation definition for renewable electricity generation. Sorry, that's a mouthful, which I've recommended. So we have referred throughout the chapter to renewable electricity generation activities, which is defined, but then we've also referred to renewable electricity generation, which hadn't been defined. So I think it's a useful addition to the definition there. And then energy objective 3 and energy policy 11. So Mercury sought further relief above their original submission. I've mentioned scope there, but I don't actually know if there is an issue there. It was more just clarifying. To replace the words constraints, technical, locational and operational with the defined terms functional and operational, functional needs and operational needs, which we've had ongoing discussions. And Maria, I assume you're going to ask me where those terms have come from. As reiterated by some of the submitters, it's the national planning standards, but it's similar terms have sort of peppered throughout other national legislation, so MPSs, and I think even the NES, but also the Southern Regional Policy Statement. That does happen throughout the objectives and policies there. So that's why, and it seems to be a useful defined term that creates a sort of more succinct policy framework by using them. And then the repowering of wind farms. So in my supplementary evidence, I recommended rejecting. I have actually, just having listened to Mercury yesterday, I've got another suggestion, which is where we could potentially deal with it in Energy Rule 2 as a restricted discretionary activity. So at the moment, Energy Rule 2 provides for the upgrading of existing large-scale renewable electricity generation activities as a discretionary activity, but as sort of outlined yesterday, sort of the consented environment that they've created by already having a wind farm up there, I do think you could change that to a restricted discretionary for either whether it's repowering or upgrading. I'm relaxed on the terminology used there. I don't think having the 10% is necessarily a useful addition. As they said, if you're going into land that wasn't previously utilised, then that's a bit of a different consideration, would require new consent anyway. but this would be essentially providing within the plan the equivalent of a variation to a resource consent, which, while that's discretionary, I think potentially a restricted discretionary consenting framework could be considered there. And that would mean you wouldn't need a new rule, you just rejig Rule 2 slightly.
Well, we'd need some matters.
Yes, oh, and I did think about that. So in Standard 1, there's some useful matters of discretion that could be utilised there. Potentially from what Stuart was saying yesterday, he was sort of mentioning earthworks as being something that might need to be considered, but then I guess the earthworks chapter kicks in then anyway. So potentially these matters of discretion, which are, just to save you from reading it, the type, scale, form and location of the turbine and any adverse effects on the character, amenity or cultural values refer to Mana Whenua 2.3 of the locality. The ability to mitigate any adverse visual effects or effects on cultural values through the use of screening, planting, alternative design, adverse noise and vibration effects. So that's already the restricted discretionary matters of discretion within Standard 1. So potentially similar could be carried over.
So then my follow-up question is why the choice for restricted discretionary and not controlled is asked for, and thinking, I guess you've just given one explanation, which is it's like a change of conditions to a resource consent, which I can see the logic to. Obviously the driver for the controlled activity status is associated with the low emissions economy transition element to this.
Yeah.
So just if you could give me your thoughts on why RD not CA.
Yeah, sure. The first one that pops into mind is 10 working days is a really short time frame to deal with an application like this for controlled activity. But also I think there is the policy support that does give them quite a bit of surety of approval anyway. It just, yeah. Cool. And I think that's it for my supplementary evidence. Any questions on that or into the 42A or?
In your 42A report, page 78, 462, the Hokanui Runanga submission.
70.
They were seeking amendments.
Sorry, which paragraph was it again?
Oh, paragraph 462.
462.
In your section 42.
Oh, yes, we have not had any more specific feedback, so I've just aligned my changes to previous changes that we've made, and I think that the next hearing there's going to be more discussion of firming those up. So whatever that ends up being, I recommend aligning with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything from them.
I wondered about that. Page 89. The Southern District Council submission, they were speaking about avoiding prominent ridge lines.
Which paragraph, sorry?
528.
528. That's about
88,
the unique...
Sorry.
Oh, right, I see.
Page 88.
Yeah, I did call Southland District Council and they said they no longer had any issues. So I don't really know what to do with that.
No.
In terms of prominent ridgelines, I mean, that's largely dealt with through the landscape chapter with the ONL. We did do a district-wide landscape study of considering whether anything met that outstanding natural features and landscape value, and that Hokanui Hills was the only one that was considered to do that. I wasn't... yeah, I mean, in terms of avoiding ridge lines across the board, that then becomes very restrictive with a lot of renewable energy generation activities because they need ridge lines to function. So I guess that's where that functional and operational need comes in. What have I actually said?
No, you did reject it.
Yeah.
You thought it could be
Yeah,
unnecessary.
for the same reasons that I've just said. Yeah.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Okay. The other one I had is on page 98. It was the Federated Farmers talking about reverse sensitivity.
What paragraph?
581.
See, the objective has changed. Just the safe. Yeah, I've recommended adopting their proposed relief. So they just wanted to include the safe and efficient operation on an existing objective 4.
Sorry, so that's, you have amended that in objective 4?
Yes. So in Appendix B. So previously it would have been worded, the efficient operation and maintenance and upgrading of existing electricity generation activities is not constrained or compromised by reverse sensitivity effects. And they had recommended adding in the safe and efficient, which
yes.
I've recommended adopting.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. That's what I was getting to yesterday when I was talking about noise from the...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A question, I've been following the reference to encouraging renewable energy generation and a move away from non-renewables. So I've looked at that all the way through, and I direct you to page 94, paragraph 560, and it's a recommendation, and I'll read it. The national significance and local, regional and national benefits derived from the use of development of renewable energy resources are recognised and provided for, and the transitional need for non-renewable energy is appropriately, and this is and sustainably managed. How do you sustainably manage a non-renewable? Does that necessarily have sustainably?
That was from a Forest and Bird submission. So they essentially said that it aligns better with the purpose of the RMA. And I think Contact Energy wanted it to be suitably managed.
I think that's more appropriate.
Yeah, well, I kind of consider they're not mutually exclusive. I think they're probably both as vague as each other in terms of their definition. And then I think it aligns with the wording in the RMA Part 2, Section 5.2 as well, the sustainably managed. So it's direct wording from the RMA, which is why I've recommended using that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So your changes from encouraged to provided for, is that also...
Sorry, which changes?
Well, I've just noted through the whole energy section 42A report, the word provide for, when we're talking about energy.
Yeah.
If you talk about energy P11 or energy, it's quite all the way through, P2 and 3.
I think that was from a submission. I'm just finding it. I think that's to align with national direction.
Yes, I
need
wondered
to,
that. It's recommendation 606, page 101.
Thank you. Yeah, that was from Mercury Energy, who we heard from yesterday. because it so provide for aligns with the national policy statement for renewable energy generation, whereas encourage and facilitate a bit more vague. So this was just to be more directive and also to align with national direction. So I recommended supporting those changes.
I'm having trouble going through, sifting between my questions and flippant comments about things requested.
Can I just ask you about the Department of Conservation submission on page 108, 646? And you suggested it does not apply to the...
Yeah, so in the supplementary evidence, they've provided further information and we've agreed with their position. So I initially rejected their relief because the MPS reg excludes the MPS for Indigenous biodiversity from consideration. So on that basis, I had rejected it, but on further considering their evidence for the hearing, in my supplementary evidence, we've recommended a partial accepting. So we haven't accepted the highly mobile fauna and their habitats aspect because that's just, it's not mapped. It's very, you're essentially going down a track where everyone would need to get a site-specific ecology and fauna study to prove that they're complying. So we didn't recommend that, but in my supplementary evidence, we did change the policy support to include effects on significant natural areas and areas of Indigenous biodiversity. And then for any activity that's actually removing Indigenous biodiversity, you're then looking at the eco chapter. So that's where it's the hook scoops you up, and then you've got this policy support in the infrastructure, the energy chapter.
Thank you.
I've got no questions. It's a big report. It must have taken you a long time to write it.
It
took a long time to read it.
Yep.
I've always got questions. So what I might do, in the way that you just delivered, you started by responding to the different submitted evidence. So I've just done a wee check through to see if there was anything I wanted to pick up from those bits of evidence. So that's what I'm about to do before then going to the section 42A. And my first thing is to have another look at the Transpower evidence. So just one moment.
It's page 6 of the supplementary evidence, Transpower. I did have a meeting with Ms. McLeod before my supplementary evidence was released just to go through a few things.
I think that's been very helpful because we can see that there's a lot of alignment with just one matter left, so much appreciated. Now, I know that you've resolved this, but I did have a question around in Transpower's evidence at paragraph 41, which is dealing with INFR 01, I could see why you'd landed where you'd landed, but I did wonder about that this specific mention of the regionally significant, nationally and critical infrastructure. I'll just double check where you landed in your appendix, so I'm not.
I recommended adopting her proposed wording for infrastructure policy 6, A and B.
Right, so I'm talking about infrastructure 01.
Oh. Yeah, there's a bigger story behind that.
Yeah, okay.
So this ties into the matters of discretion. So Ms McLeod had, in my 42, or in her original evidence, requested that matters of discretion to consider the benefits of infrastructure be included. I had initially rejected that largely because from a Section 95 perspective, you can't consider positive effects. So it just sort of seemed like a pointless floating matter of discretion. However, having met with Ms McLeod, she raised the point that if it's a restricted discretionary activity and there's not a specific matter of discretion, you're raising the risk that those relevant objectives and policies aren't pulled in, which I agree with. So while from a 95 Section 95 assessment in your resource consent, it's not particularly useful, it is when it comes to 104. So that's also why I recommended changing objective 1 to include that. It was, lots of thought and going around in circles for a second, but we got there in the end, I think.
So the thing that I could see that was present in her original recommendation for 01 included the reference to the regionally significant, nationally significant and critical infrastructure. So I'm just...
Is this in her original submission as opposed to supplementary?
Yes, I think it was in her original evidence at paragraph 41. Anyway, so if I look at your Appendix A and infrastructure 01.
I think in her original evidence, which I addressed in my 42A, I'm sorry, I don't have the paragraph in front of me, but
Yep.
Her initial wording was quite wordy.
Yes, it was, yeah.
And
there was repetition.
There was repetition,
Yep.
so she refined that through her evidence for the hearing, and that's what I'm supporting,
Yep.
that refined version. And
Okay.
I believe we're on the same page now with what works for Transpower and what works for the district plan.
So then am I to read 012 as effectively picking up the nationally significant, regionally significant and critical infrastructure? It was really the reference that she had in her original wording to those defined terms that aren't now in 01, but she had suggested they should be or could be. And instead we've got 012, which doesn't use those defined terms, but is that effectively what it's trying to pick up?
Yes.
Then is there any value in revisiting the defined terms, or can we be comfortable?
I mean, I think we can probably be fairly comfortable, but I don't have any objection to revisiting the defined terms.
I think that's it in terms of what I wanted to pick up from all of that, because you are all in agreement aside from that one matter. So I'm going to check a question I had in relation to PowerNet and see if that's been resolved. So I think this is where you were. This is the matter. So in Ms. Justice's evidence for PowerNet at her paragraph 52, she's talking about the above ground up to 25 metre height in general industrial and light industrial zone. And I had a little question, I think, in relation to the above ground and underground element. Yes, so it's where at her paragraph 52 she's saying INFR4 is sort of pushing things to go underground, and yet we're making provision for these poles up to 25 metres high in these industrial spaces. And so that those two things were in tension. And is this where where practicable matter comes in?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Could you rephrase?
No, I've just realised that my question is not just. No, we've already covered this. This is everything that's not otherwise covered in the other rules. So whatever she was raising, I think, is probably addressed.
What time do you have to be away by?
Don't worry, I don't have much longer. It's just the slow process of double checking. So a lot of what Doc were raising we can expect we will tease out in the eco hearing and then come back and revisit as necessary. Yep. All right. So I've just done that quick double check with the submitters in there. Alrighty. So functional and operational need. You've given me your partial answer. Well, it's a full answer, but I think it raised something for me when you were saying about functional need and operational need being in the objectives of the energy chapter, but you were arguing against them in the infrastructure chapter. I'm wondering if the reason for those differences in the two chapters might well be the higher order instruments. Do you think that's true?
Potentially. So I did not draft the original iteration of either of these chapters, so I can't tell you off the top of my head, but that's quite possible, and preferable to think rather than just an error.
And when we think about functional need and operational need, there's a relationship with consideration of alternatives. Would you agree?
Yes.
So how are we thinking about that I guess what I'm getting at is I want to know that when we're using these terms, we're using them appropriately, and I think that where they're used in some of these higher order instruments, in the newer ones, it's got a relationship with the effects management hierarchy for the newest. But in the older, in these renewable energy spaces, there's the consideration of alternatives element, has a role that's part of their long-standing direction and practice. Is that something that needs to always be present when we are utilising functional need and operational need as a kind of an extra pass for something?
I think it probably ends up just happening anyway with the district plan. I mean, I'm just thinking of the example of a wind farm in the Hokonui Hills. There might be a functional need to be as high as possible, but there's other aspects at play that mean that's unlikely. That they're not putting the Kawerau wind farm on top of the Hokonui Hills, aside from the ownership aspect. There's other parts in the plan that you're weighing things up. It's not just if there's a functional and operational need, it's a immediate pass.
Does that take into account fast tracking?
I couldn't comment outside of the district plan process. Yeah.
Right up the top, what's his paragraph 60, but so at paragraph 60, there's consideration of NZTA and the inclusion of the state highway network in critical infrastructure. So now I just want to check the critical infrastructure definition, because at the moment in that discussion, it's just mentioning Gore, not the Gore district, and I'm sure that's not what we mean.
Yes, I agree. So if you go to Appendix D, that's the latest iteration of the critical infrastructure definition recommendation. That is meant to be the Southland region and the Gore district.
Yes, and
Yes.
so that's probably, although no one specifically said that, we can just get on and do that, can't we?
The intention of that is, not just Gore. It doesn't exclude Mataura or any of the settlement areas and rural area. It's the district. Yeah.
Right, so where at your paragraph 70 you're discussing the New Zealand Defence Force and defence facilities and wondering if they're best defined within emergency services facilities, and that those policy settings would be suitable to deal with defence facilities. So are you thinking that there is any amendment required to the emergency services facilities to be clear that it's managing defence facilities? I really just wanted to tease this out a little bit more, because I know that they're not present in the hearing, but they're making sort of consistent arguments for us to be thinking about the needs of defence facilities that might not be present in the district, I guess, but might come in at some point, and how would we deal with them? So yeah, do we need anything done to the emergency services facilities definition to accommodate that?
No, the emergency service facility definition already includes defence facilities. I think that's
Oh, okay.
quite clear. Yeah,
Check it before I ask.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it includes but is not limited to whole list, and one of those is defence facilities.
Right. Once again, I suspect we've asked a lot of these already, so just bear with me. So yesterday I asked the question around, I think I asked it of Ms. Perkins. No, it was in relation to, no, it was Ms. Justice, I think. But anyway, this idea that the distribution network had potentially been left off because it didn't have higher order document support. But I had wondered if the critical infrastructure that we're talking about is routinely network utility operators and requiring authority operators. And is that a useful way to assist the definition in any way?
Are you suggesting that network utility operators and network utilities be included within the definition of critical infrastructure, or that the critical infrastructure definition should be replaced by just network?
If those terms are defined and understood, and most of what's in the critical infrastructure definition is captured by those, I guess no one's actually asking for it. It was more the rationale behind bringing in the distribution network in. It was a way of sort of knowing that it just seemed to me that there was a very close overlap between them, and maybe that's it. Maybe nothing further needs to be done.
There is quite an extensive definition for network utilities in the district plan.
Initially, in the very first hearing, the intro hearing, I was really concerned about these overlapping definitions of what's regionally significant, nationally significant, critical infrastructure, network utility, lifeline utility, and whether we need all of those things or whether we need some rationalisation so that people don't have to keep jumping back to the interpretation to work out, is this thing in that definition or that definition?
Yeah.
Or all of them?
I think I wouldn't recommend including the definition for network utilities within the umbrella definition of critical infrastructure. I think it's much broader than critical infrastructure, so I'd want to be careful there. I mean, I think we probably could put in a distribution, sorry, the exact terminology is escaping me, but as per Ms. Justice's recommendation, I think we probably could put in a definition for distribution lines and yards. I just would want it to be more structured and more nuanced than her existing suggestion. I just think it's too broad.
At your paragraph 252, this is where you're discussing the green infrastructure, and at the moment it's reading prioritisation of green infrastructure, and I'm not sure that that's what you mean, although that's what was requested. I wondered if it was more like increased use, because prioritisation would say this is the thing to emphasise over and above alternatives, which is one way to look at it. But if really what we're talking about is, because at the policy level it's encourage, you see, there's a mismatch, I think, between prioritisation and encouraging. And so I thought perhaps prioritisation should be changed to increased use.
Yep.
And that looking into the future, that's really what we're saying. We're saying there'll be a mix of the hard structures in the green infrastructure, but we need more of the green infrastructure.
I would support that change in wording.
Look, I think I've come to the end of the questions I want to ask you, actually. I think most of what we've covered, we've covered everything already. So I guess that's just left for us to craft those minutes, one in relation to the distribution network and the matters we discussed this morning with Earthworks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Those reports, obviously a lot of work, huge amount of work.
Thank you.
Okay, so my suggestion is that we adjourn the hearing so that Stony Creek can provide further response on the supplementary evidence that we talked about yesterday. And by adjourning, if the admin team can actually send an email to Stony Creek saying that we've adjourned the hearing awaiting submission or receipt of their comments on the supplementary evidence. And then that removes the need of issuing a formal minute. And I don't think there's any need for their response to be circulated to anybody else. I think if the panel have got any queries arising from it in terms of the reporting team, that can be included in the minutes that are being done. Or at a later date if the minutes go out earlier.
Thanks for that. On that basis, I'll adjourn the meeting.